Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. Today we're going to be looking at the top performing archetypes in the City Leagues in Japan, which equate to our Temporal Forces format. We're going to be looking at great detail into these deck lists, talking about the most common 60s as well as the most common tech inclusions for the best performing builds out in Japan. So should give you a really good starting point, a really good basis for not only picking up decks to test yourself, but also deck lists to test against that are going to be relatively consistent and proven to perform. So let's talk about the methodology. Huge shout out to Trainer Hill, actually, who reached out to me and has created a City League scraping tool, which has made life so much easier for me. And it's a really fantastic thing. It's in its beta stage, but I'm very happy to be a guinea pig for them. And this has made my life so much easier. And I do think this will be an exceptional resource once it goes live to the greater public. But the long story short is it's allowed me to take a look at 207 City Leagues. These are all between the dates of Feb 18th to March 13th. This is all post the Champions League in Fukuoka, so they've already had one big tournament to sort of direct their testing, their deck lists, that sort of thing. And I've chopped away the top 16 deck lists. I'm only looking at top 8 plus, because even though top 16 is a pretty solid record in 64 player tournaments, I think getting records for top 8 is much more impressive overall. It still gives us, hundreds of deck lists to scrape through to help us give a general average, but taking away some of the worst 60s, I suppose, the ones with the slightly worse records, I think is going to be a little bit more helpful here. And as we go through the deck list, you'll notice that these are the most common quantities of the most popular card choices within each archetype. So just as a very quick, easy example, if Nest Ball is most commonly seen as a 4 count in the deck list, you'll see the deck list has 4 copies of Nest Ball in it. Very logical, very simple, and it's going to make the deck list look pretty straightforward. There will be situations when the skeleton that gets generated isn't quite 60 cards. You'll notice for the Lost Zone here that the skeleton only pumped out 58 cards. So in these instances, I have either taken, like you can see with the emergency board here, the most common count is 1, but to get to 60 cards, I think, because there is also a 2 count that is relatively frequent, I would sometimes bump up counts of cards already existing in the deck list, or for this exact example, I've tried to take a logical approach where if Raikou is showing up in a number of deck lists, then Forest Stone is oftentimes going to accompany that Raikou, and in other deck lists every now and then there's just going to be a different Forest Stone user, but the general idea is that the deck wants to likely play a V Pokemon to have a Forest Stone target so that you have an extra Lost Vacuum target and just better outs to Chorus, so that's generally just a reasonable card to include. So I have taken somewhat of a common sense approach, but for the most part, these skeletons spit out 58, 59 cards, sometimes even 60 cards on the nose, and in that instance I have only ever taken the most common count of the cards within these lists. So these are going to be really good, straightforward deck lists, which more or less average out to be the standard 60s. With that being said, let's talk about the number 1 performing deck in City Leagues in Japan right now. I've once again taken the top 8 placements and better from these City Leagues and equated League Cup Championship points to them. I've stripped away all the top 16 data because I do think there's a lot of popularity bias between archetypes. If I was just to have more top 16 placements, you'd essentially just see buffed stats for Charizard's, Chien Pao's, Lost Boxes, these sorts of things, because they're very, very popular. I think only showing the top 8s, obviously there's still going to be some bias for popularity, but I think it does strip out a decent amount of it. And once again, we want to see the best performers. Top 16 placements are decent, but they've probably taken losses here and there, whereas top 8s are going to have much more ruthless records, probably only lost once or twice throughout the entire day at that City League tournament. So Charizard is popular and it's performing at the highest level right now. The Barrel is coming out on top over Pidgeot right now in Japan. You'll notice there's still a heavy emphasis on Arvum with the 3 copies in here. A decent split of tools with still a damage modifying option within the deck list, but Prime Catcher being the A-spec of choice, providing a pivot for your deck list as well as being an extra means of picking off Pokemon from your opponent's side of the field. TM Evolution can help support the Barrel, and also is why you'll see 2 Charmeleons in the deck list, and also why you see just the 3 copies of Rare Candy rather than the full 4 count. For other new cards, there's the Buddy Buddy Poffin, so we can get all of our basics into play nice and early, and also the Code Breaker is in the deck list to try and combine with Industrious Incisors so that we can guarantee cards on top of the deck and draw immediately into them, which is obviously a fantastic combo once our engine is established. Now we're getting on to the kind of best of the rest cards, if you will, the cards that don't quite make the standard 60 60, but still show up in a number of deck lists, and cards that you could consider coming into your deck list if you want to make cuts from the list that you just saw. You'll notice that Lumineon actually didn't make it into the core 60 cards. I think the main reason to not play Lumineon would be that so you have even more control over your opponent's prize map and try and force a single prize board state. That's mostly what Big Barrel is trying to do compared to a Pidgeot 60, where you can try and guarantee that your Radiant Zard gets value, gets a punch in, your opponent takes a one prize knockout, which doesn't always change their prize race, for you then to just get another Charizard EX into the mix. So you're trying to offset the prize race with that regard. That's why you see Rotom is far less popular, only like 13% play the Rotom, but also partly because you want to end your turn on TM Evolution in a lot of situations, especially if you've gone second, of course. So the Rotom is far less popular in Big Barrel builds. Lumineon is obviously less popular because it's below the 50% mark, so a number of these lists are obviously doing well without it, but I felt like it was worth including in the deck list just for that extra bump of consistency. You jump a huge number of outs to get your early game supporter, especially when the list I showed only plays 3 copies of Iono and 3 copies of Arven. Possibly if you want to make the Lumineon cut, you could go up in counts with your supporters physically as well. Also, you notice Entei is somewhat of a popular choice. Sometimes it's going to be instead of Lumineon to still have a Forest Hill Stone target to make the use out of your Arven, but Entei being a different attacking presence in the deck list. Definitely worth considering the likes of Professor Churro Scenario and Jet Energy. So far on the list there's 1 Prime Catcher, 1 Switch, so we are quite light against the controlling archetypes, so you can see why these sometimes make their way into the list as well. For my own personal preference, I want to keep Charizard kind of simple and not really cut into the counts too much. I would only really look towards the Churro or the Jet Energy if I was really concerned about controlling matchups. We're going to quickly hop that second place list just so we can keep Charizard all in one place here, where we look at Charizard Pidgeot, which has in its own right still continued to perform very, very well here, with 5,865 championship points, the 3rd individually best performing archetype. If you lump the Charizards together, it means it is really outclassing pretty much everything in the game right now. The key differences between the Big Barrel archetype and the Pidgeot, of course, we go all the way up to those 4 rare candies because we have an extra stage 2 in the deck list, and we're a lot more liberal putting these Lumineon, these Rotom into play, etc., because we already have Pidgeot established on the board alongside our Charizard in a lot of situations, so there's always going to be multi-prize knockouts for the opponent, but we're going to try and make it hard for them because, of course, we're going to be spamming Iono and still throwing Charizards at their face throughout the entirety of the game. There's also an interesting switch up that the maximum belt makes the space in the Charizard Pidgeot build, whereas Prime Catcher is much more popular in Bib. I think partly because Big Barrel needs more inherent switching cards within the deck list because Pidgeot provides a free retreater for us in the list, but also I think because we are establishing many more multi-prizes on our own board as the Pidgeot player, it's more imperative for us to get early game damage presence with Charizard EX's Burning Darkness, so maximum belt is required in terms of the tempo of the game to make sure that we're cashing in on these Burning Darkness earlier on, so the opponent can't run away with the prize race when we can't deny them later in the game. Support count remains very similar, but a Roxanne has been added into the equation. Like I said, trying to disrupt the opponent is still imperative, and a Mist Energy tech option makes it into this 60. Again, I think this is a situation where your matchup with the Pidgeot build is slightly weaker into Giratina than a Big Barrel build would be in terms of an easy prize map, so having Mist Energy to protect a Charizard from an easy Vstar KO can be an important option for you. Same time against Roaring Moon EX, and at the same time this helps against TM Devolution as well, which Big Barrel is far less concerned about, but obviously this build is far more concerned about being devolved. If you can stick this Mist Energy onto Pidgeot, for example, that could be a great way of retaining your draw engine, or at least denying a multi-prize Devo turn if the opponent's been setting up damage across the board. As for tech options, not too different to be honest with you. You can see there's a bit more debate around the ace spec within the Charizard Pidgeot builds than the Big Barrel ones. Defiance Band versus Choice Belt was also an interesting one. The Choice Belt kind of being much more limited, whereas Defiance can come in certainly in mirror match situations and up against a few more EX style matchups. In this list, you'll notice there are some more tech attacking basic fire Pokemon, Gouging Fire being able to wall break through a low in Vulpix and have high early game damage output, and Delphox V providing a kind of surprise sniping option within the deck list for possible early game multi-prize turns. Another tiny thing to bear in mind is that 12% of lists that are playing Pidgeot also play a 1-1 Big Barrel line. It's funny how Tord actually played a list recently at a tournament with both Pidgeot and Big Barrel in the same list of Charizard, because it seems like in City Leagues that's also being taken on. It allows the Charizard Pidgeot player to much more freely use their Iono and give themselves more frequent top-ups throughout the game. On to the second best performing archetype in the City Leagues. With 6,050 championship points earned, we have strictly the Greninja Gate builds off Lost Zone box, and it's those two Paradox attackers combining to be great threats here. Iron Hands and Roaring Moon provide decent type coverage. They offer multi-prize options into single-prize Pokemon, thank you very much, and into multi-prize threats with that Frenzied Gouging. The archetype is, of course, very happy to see Prime Catcher as a big gusting upgrade in the list. It's also happy to see the emergency board chip in to give yourself a nice pivot throughout the game. A possibly surprising staple is the Iron Bundle. This again gives you more bench pressure in the opening stages with that Hyper Blower, but it's also in here to try and defend against Fluttermane, which would otherwise wall out to your flower selecting. Fluttermane isn't common in a number of archetypes, but every now and then has been teched in, even into the likes of Charizard, as a 1 count to slow down Lost Zone players, so it seems like the Lost Zone boxes are trying to remain one step ahead in that regard. As for changing up this 60, the Forest Hill Stone I added into the deck list because it was already playing a Raikou, and I also squeezed in 1 copy of Pokegear, which is relatively frequent within these lists and is often seen in the Western builds of Lost Box. Having played a good amount of this archetype, I've not found the Artisan to be all that powerful, so if I was to be playing Lost Box, I'd look to change up the stadium count that little bit. Even if you're just cutting to 1 Artisan and adding in 1 Pokestop or 1 Town Store, I do think these provide a decent amount of value. I'd personally also like to find a space for a second copy of the emergency board. I think it's such a powerful tool. And another big consideration is that genome hacking option from MUEX. We're already quite thin on the attacking options within the deck list. Genome hacking is obviously very versatile, but there is a good amount of Giratina still in the format. There's still Radiant Greninja and a ton of archetypes. And similar to the Crisis Punch, which is showing up in some Lost Box lists, this can be another late game attacking option into the Charizard matchup. So those would be kind of my top techs that are currently not within the 60. For the 4th best performer in the City Leagues, we have Chien Pao Baxcalibur with 4,390 championship points earned. Chien Pao is one of the big beneficiaries of some of the new cards in the format. The Buddy Poffin works really nicely in the list to get multiple Bidoof and Frigibacks developed early. Prime Catcher is of course Irida searchable, so it does give you great bench control over your opponent, especially alongside a copy of Counter Catcher. And the Codebreaker makes it into this list as a single count. It can work nicely off concealed cards, Pokestop, and B Barrel in the list, so there's no shortage of means to pop off with this card. Chien Pao's of course been given the luxury of space with the post-rotation format because it no longer has to play 4 copies of Pokestop to deal with Path to the Peak, and instead is opting for a healthier support account, making me think that in a blind Game 1 scenario, you actually want to go second with the deck list because we are still setup reliant, but we finally have a reasonable supporter line to lean into. As for some other cards which have been showing up in a number of these Chien Pao lists, the Kyogre is certainly another interesting single prize attacking option to try and force your prize map in a certain direction. The Kyogre, of course, very good at taking 2 prize knockouts on the lower hit point V Pokemon like Rotom and Lumineon. Can also be very solid in the mirror match because, as you can see, Manaphy isn't a staple and in fact is commonly not found in these Chien Pao lists, so it could be a great way to control your opponent's bench a little bit. Chien Pao is still about maximizing your ratios to actually cycle through the deck and find these combos turn to turn, so I would be liberal in adding in any additional tech cards, but Manaphy and Kyogre are kind of the standouts to me right now. In the 5th best performing City League deck, we have Lugia Vstar Archeops with 3,971 championship points earned, and basically everyone has taken the stock 60 from the Fukuoka Champions League. No surprise there, it won the tournament, and there aren't any really wild counts. Chinchino being this fantastic beat stick single prize attacker, which is kind of the selling point, the reason why Lugia's had this huge resurgence. And Miss Energy is a nice colorless energy card which sort of joins the mix. Definitely going to be a frustrating card for Lost Zone box players, Giratina players, Roaring Moon builds as well. The deck's still a little bit clunky, but it plays off the board really nicely and has great ways to offset a prize race, so it does have great comeback potential in the format as well. Because this list has been so successful and has been used over and over again, there really aren't many other cards that you'd consider going into Lugia because there really aren't many easy cuts within the deck list unless you want to take away from the core strategy, which is just bin your Archeops, get your Summoning Star going. So making any space within the list is hard to justify right now. If anything, it's going to be toying around with counts, like possibly you could reduce your energy count by 1, possibly you could add or change up your Ball Search line, possibly weaving in a second copy of Lumineon, something like that. So those are the things that I'd justify over any of these other less popular inclusions. For the 6th best performing deck, we have the Future Iron Hands build with 3,798 championship points earned. Once again, the Fukuoka 60 kind of became the norm. I think the big difference is that pretty much everyone cut the Morty from the list and also reduced that crazy Counter Catcher count that was previously 4 copies to incorporate 2 copies of Pokegear and 2 copies of Boss's Orders to keep your prize map a little bit more flexible by having more options to gust throughout the game. Speaking of which, Prime Catcher has also found its way into the deck list over the reboot pod. This does make you a little bit more vulnerable with your heavy batons if they get vacuumed away, and essentially forces your electric generators to hit a little bit more frequently, but in doing so, that Prime Catcher unlocks a lot of power for you, especially when your high roll situations with hitting from generator can sometimes result in a turn 1 attack with an arm press, and if you're buffing it with your Future Booster or your Iron Crown, that can mean an early 2 prize knockout on Evolving V Pokemon, which can ruin some opponents' early setup. There are a few interesting other additions. Kind of my favorite actually is the Psychic Energy as a 1 count. I think it allows your Miraidon attack to be a little bit more flexible. Oftentimes putting an extra energy onto your active single prize Pokemon is somewhat hedging for your your opponent trying to look to gust your 2 prizes regardless, it means that if they are going to make that play, you can once again bring the Miraidon into the active, attach a 3rd energy onto it to become a threat in its own right, to once again force your opponent into a situation where they have to gust again. When we're already playing Boss, Pokegear, and Countercatcher, I think you already have a decent amount of control over Gust, so there's still a debate whether or not Reboot Pod is the best. It seems like Prime Catcher has really overtaken it in popularity, but whenever I've played the list so far, I've been really thankful to have the Reboot Pod for some guaranteed extra attachments throughout the game. So I'm personally kind of torn on this one, even though it's dropping rapidly out of popularity. For the 7th best performing archetype, we have Arceus Giratina, with 3,480 championship points earned. Arceus Giratina can power through the Charizard matchup much better than previously, thanks to the maximum belt inclusion that can push Giratina's Lost Impact into a 1-hit KO, as well as the Iron Leaves EX as a grass tech attacking option. And as you can see, with that high Iono and Judge count, you're still trying to disrupt the opponent on most turns of the game, knowing that you have the Industrious Incisors Nest Stash combination, so that you can continue to cycle quite happily. And kind of the new star player for Arceus is the Eri supporter. I think there's so many ways you can really cheese opponents by removing some crucial resources. This will oftentimes be chosen over or instead of an Iono or Judge with your early game star buff. Trying to snipe Ultra Balls, rare candies, superior energy retrievals. Who knows, sometimes you can snipe your opponent's ace spec card. There's so many things the Eri can hit right now, which can once again stunt your opponent's next turn, buying you more time to get extra Trinity Novas and your board develop that little bit further. As for other cards to consider outside of the standard 60, the League headquarters could be in addition to or instead of the Lost City. This one kind of depends once again on the metagame. If you're expecting more Great Tusk Mill, more Ancient Box, more Lost Box, the League HQ may be preferred, but Lost City is of course a great way to remove resources from your opponent for good. And then we have kind of the damage modifiers of Radiant Gardevoir in a defensive sense and Choice Belt in an aggressive sense. The belt can help you get around V-Guard energy against the Lugia matchup, and the Radiant Gardevoir can protect you from Giratina in mirror match situations or against the Lost Zone Giratina builds, at least forcing a V-Star out of them. It's easy to see why these cards don't necessarily make it into the standard 60s, but these are worth teching in if you expect an uptick in either of these archetypes. In at number 8, we have the Lost Zone build of Giratina with 3,219 championship points earned. Once again, Iron Leaves has found a new home in this list because you're naturally already playing a decent amount of grass energy, and Mirage Gate to supplement it to have a 1-hit KO option into Charizard, alongside your Star Requiem. Giratina also more than happy to gain the emergency board and Prime Catcher, similar to how Lost Box has incorporated these cards. The real standout card to me is the Forest Stone becoming a very common inclusion in Giratina Vstar. You will be using Star Requiem in a huge number of matchups, so it was a real surprise to see the Forest Stone in over 80% of the best performing Tina builds, and I'd definitely like to hear your thoughts on that one. There are some other counts within the deck list that I would like to bolster, things like an extra Buddy Poffin, possibly a 3rd copy of Super Rod, but I could also definitely see myself making a space for 1 copy of Temple of Sinnoh. It gives you an out around Mist Energy, as well as V-Guard Energy, which are both found within the Lugia list, and every now and then we are seeing that Mist Energy pop up in Charizard builds, in some Arc builds as well. So in order to unlock your V-Star power, I could see it being a reasonable include. In at number 9, we have Roaring Moon with 2,100 championship points earned. It's a pretty interesting case here where previously the Ancient Box was outperforming the Roaring Moon EX, but that's actually swung back in favor of a build that is looking really to hybrid between Roaring Moon EX and still having 4 copies of the new Roaring Moon single prize attacking option and some Dark Patch to supplement your energy acceleration so that we can Frenzy Gouge and Calamity Storm when required. The deck is still playing 25 Ancient cards, so you actually can get to a decent threshold with your single prizer, but the Roaring Moon EX is of course going to chip into the likes of Charizard and possibly some of your V-Star matchups in the opening stages. This is actually one of the archetypes that I've played the least with because I actually have more experience with a pure single prize build, so it's one that I'm looking forward to trying out once again. As for other potential inclusions, when you're already playing the Pal Pad, Roxanne seems like a reasonable consideration, so you can give yourself a pretty decent hand size and have some disruption to go back at your opponent with in matchups like Lost Box and other aggressive archetypes. And even though Squawkability X is far worse in a Roaring Moon deck without the option to have VIP pass, there can still be those situations where possibly getting an extra 6 cards with Squawkencies could unlock an early Starter's Vitality to get some earlier pressure down. Possibly it means you can get a turn 1 Frenzied Gouging or Calamity Storm completely blowing up the opponent's board, so having a sort of burst aggressive option available in the deck could punish slower starts from your opponent and get some free wins. For the 10th best performing deck, we have Snorlax Stall with 2,027 championship points earned. Its performance actually would go slightly above the Roaring Moon 60 if we were taking into account Snorlax Pidgeot builds as well. Not by a huge amount, but I did think it was worth noting that this is purely looking at the non-Pidgeot EX builds. Of course, we're a big beneficiary of the Eri supporter and very happy to have the Hero's Cape upgrade to the Luxurious Cape. We are playing some basic energy in the list, so we can have Active Meal from Chi Yu EX, we can have Pseudo Echoing Horn Thorn option from Mantine's Born Ashore attack, as well as the option to actually damage pressure our opponent with Mimikyu in certain situations. Honestly, the deck doesn't change too much from post-rotation, except we lose that Echoing Horn and we do lose Peonia. There is a little bit of risk involved with playing single copies of certain cards within the list, so there could be an argument to bolster some of these counts. As for cards kind of landing outside of the staple 60, I actually was playing 2 copies of the Crushing Hammer to put my way up to 60 cards within the deck list. If you're not a believer in the Crushing Hammers, you could once again just think about having a second copy of Silene, for example, just have a little bit more control over your anti-deck out cycle. I personally think Crushing Hammer is showing up enough in high accounts to make me think it's worth including in the list. I can definitely see this being a frustrating card, especially when you are weaving in Eries and trying to remove certain resources from the opponent. Every now and then, removing some energy can buy turns, especially when you are trying to weave in Ionos in the latter stages. So if you're holding on to Crushing Hammers to play multiple in a turn, it can be a great way for you to buy some breathing room. If you're looking to add some pieces, I do think Luxurious Cape might still have a place within the deck list, even with Hero's Cape being an option. Again, mostly out of a protecting yourself from prizing sense. And I definitely like the argument for Jet Energy. I think it can make the Mimikyu use, or the Mantine use certainly, much more immediate by pole vaulting your way into the active position. The list right now is only using your Penny as well as Switch Cart as means of moving, so the Jet could be a welcome addition, especially if once again you're looking to Penny the Pokemon you're using it on to get multiple procs of this effect. And because we looked at 2 Charizard builds, I thought I'd do the top 11 decks, I guess, in quotes, where we have the Great Tusk Mill with 1,719 championship points earned. The Great Tusk is of course tied mostly to its ancient supporters in Professor Sada as well as Explorer's Guidance, but kind of a testament to how powerful this card is, the Eerie supporter once again pops up as a means of denying resources from the opponent. Ideally, of course, we're looking for switching outs to combine an Eerie with a counter catcher to trap something in the active to get additional turns of mill out, or even just force the opponent to play some draw supporters to cycle through their own deck. You'll notice that Pidgeot V is found within the list even without Forest Seal Stone being a common include, which goes to show how this deck also likes to be self-milling so much with its ancient supporter cards. It's actually really important to have that Vanishing Wings option so that you can spam your ancient cards as you get to the later stages of the game, making sure that Great Tusk is getting the maximum mill possible turn by turn. As for other potential inclusions, I do think the Flower Selecting Comfey is kind of interesting. There's already an emergency board in the list, and one of the best performing 60s in Fukuoka did choose to play 1 copy of this Comfey. It just gives you a little bit of extra hand reach when your Great Tusk are getting knocked out turn by turn alongside your Ready Greninja. It's pretty frequently going to be targeted by the opponent, but in doing so, it means that you don't have to use a Sada in the turn. You can instead go for a deeper dig with Explorer's Guidance, which still has upside for you throughout the game. And if you think there are any other cards that aren't really pulling their weight in the standard 60, always think about adding in Trekking Shoes just to once again give yourself that little bit extra dig towards your combos. And there's always that argument of Hand Clippers making it within the 60 to pressurize the opponent to once again play cards throughout the game. So I just wanted to end on once again a kind of reflection of how the best decks are performing right now. Charizard seems to be a little bit above everything else apart from Lost Box. Once again, a huge thank you to Trainer Hill for reaching out and giving me the chance to use their data scraping tool. You really don't know how many hours that saved me of manual labor because I'm somewhat of a caveman and useless with technology, and I can't wait for that to eventually become public. Hopefully this is a decent representation of the best performing decks in the format. Let me know what you thought about the standard 60s. Were there any counts that caught you by surprise, or are some of those key tech inclusions going to be staples within your 60 after more testing? I'll hear it all down below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow for another video. Cheers.